We're privileged today to have the opportunity to talk to Dr. Brian Leiter from the University of Chicago. I'm sure many of you guys know exactly who he is, so we just wanted to have an opportunity in the wake of hosting a talk to sit down and talk more casually. There's probably a lot of questions that people would have with regard to the Why Tolerate Religion talk. In fact, there's probably lots of things I would like to talk about in particular to that, but without the context, it probably wouldn't go over very well. So visit the link in the description below this video if you'd like to see the talk on his book, Why Tolerate Religion. But I just wanted to ask a couple of things, I suppose somewhat related to the book. So as you often have noted when you're introducing the book, it's got a provocative title. Right, perhaps more provocative than the conclusion is usually what you say. So I suspect that plenty of people, as they peruse the bookstore, probably see your book and think that you're one of what is often called the new atheist group.
Right.
Would you consider yourself part of that group? And if not, or if so, how different?
Good. Yeah. So right, the title is provocative. In fact, a philosopher told me he was reading the book on an airplane, and the passenger next to them said, "This is not the time to be reading that." It's a little bit like atheists in foxholes or something. But no, I actually, I take it one feature of the view of the so-called new atheists is that they think that since religious belief involves false belief, that is reason enough to object and be dismissive of religion. Now, I actually do think that religious belief involves some false belief, but I also think all of life depends on some degree of false belief, and I don't think the falsity of particular beliefs has any bearing on the questions about toleration. So I am not, I'm not nearly as hostile to religion as the new atheists typically are. It seems to me, partly for a million reasons, that it is good to be tolerant of many different ways of life and belief, and also makes for a more pleasant society.
Right. So in the setup to the book, you still make some claims that I'm sure plenty of religious people would disagree with.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm curious if you think that some of those claims about the nature of the plausibility of religion and those sorts of things actually affect the argument of the book. If somebody comes disagreeing in the preface and early in the first chapter, do the arguments still run the same, or do you think there are implications there?
Good. Yeah. So I think a lot of the arguments actually don't depend on my claims about what is distinctive of religious claims of consciousness. But there's one place where it may matter, which is that if one thought that religion gave one a special kind of access to truths that weren't otherwise available, except through religious modes of thought or inquiry or faith or practice or whatever the case might be, then you might think that there was actually an argument for thinking that even million considerations, right, would favor treating religion as special because it makes available a realm of truth that otherwise wouldn't be available without it. And that is not a view I accept, and that is, I think, important to the bedrock argument of the book, which is about, is there any justification for the inequality between religious and non-religious claims of conscience? That, I think, is the one place where it would make a difference to how the argument would go. That argument would have to be resolved. There's a big literature, as you well know, on the epistemology of religion.
Right.
Those books have been written. I didn't intend to rewrite it. But I think that is definitely a point where, a point of possible contention for someone who had a very different view about the epistemology of religious belief.
Yeah. On a related note, there's several instances where you're identifying this insulation from evidence, and there's a chapter where you're sort of articulating not the necessary and sufficient conditions for religion, but some essential components. And I suspect even there'll be plenty of people that are religious who would disagree with that sort of characterization of it. I know that you probably were trying to get one that everybody would capture, but if you allowed the religious person to define religion themselves, you've addressed the epistemological, perhaps, adjustment they would make. Do you think that there would be any difference with the way the rest of the chapters would go then?
Well, it's hard to answer that without knowing exactly what the alternative proposed
Sure.
definition would be. But let me say, even about the claim about, I say that one characteristic of religious claims of conscience is they're embedded in a system of beliefs in which some of the beliefs are insulated from reasons and evidence as reasons and evidence are understood in the sciences and in common sense. Mm-hmm. And I'm really just trying to capture a thought that I think is not particularly controversial, which is that religious belief involves, in part, commitments of faith.
Right.
And it's the further claim, right, that goes back to what we just discussed. Could faith, however that is understood, be give us access to a realm of truths not available to the standards of reasons and evidence as understood in the sciences? That is where I think there is a real point of contention. But I don't think that aspect of my characterization of religion is by itself problematic or need be particularly controversial. I think there are some intellectualist traditions in theology that might take some issue with it. But by and large, I think that's acceptable. What's controversial is the thought that the standards of reasons and evidence characteristic of the sciences and common sense, on my Quinian assumption that science and common sense are on a kind of epistemological continuum, the assumption that those are the only sources of knowledge of the truth, that's more controversial. Mm-hmm. Or as Robert Adams said in his review of the book in Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews, Leiter seems happy with an epistemology that would have been recognizable to the Vienna Circle. And there's something right about that. I think the Vienna Circle had the right epistemology, but for the wrong reasons. Mm. So, but as I say, that's a different book, and I feel like people have written the books and the articles about that, and I don't have anything in particular to contribute to that. So to that extent, it's a premise of the analysis that I develop that I'm right on the epistemological question. Many contemporary philosophers will not say, Brian, you are right on that question. I'm aware of that.
So certainly some people are going to, you said faith, however you define it, it seems some will think that that's going to be a crucial component. If they see faith as essentially being something that's sensitive to some extent and maybe in different ways to some of the things that we attribute to the rigors of science, but maybe reasons is accounted for in other ways that provide evidence.
Right.
It seems like you could still make a case for not special consideration, or do you think you would have to?
So I think the crucial question is whether the account of faith, right? So I understand the claim that faith and a certain kind of experience of faith could be taken as a reason for belief. That's why it's crucial in my claim about insulation that it's insulation from reasons and belief as understood in the sciences and common sense. I don't think, right, and I think that those, philosophers of religion who do think of faith as, or certain kinds of religious experience as a reason for belief, would agree with me that it's a different kind of reason than the reason that is provided by, the perceptual evidence of a table in front of us. Not all. I realize not all would, but I think in general, I don't think that's going to be the productive point of contention about what I have to say. I think it really is the point about whether there are other forms of access to the truth that are provided distinctively by religion, right, such that we then have, as I was saying, a million reasons for thinking that counts as extra special favor of religious claims of conscience as against non-religious claims.
So if we went to what would be the extreme in the course of the debate, and let's just, if we assumed that God did in fact exist, and then let's go into, say, like a Rawlsian scenario, where the people in the original position, they know several relevant things, and one thing that they were told is that God does in fact exist, but then in the society, there's going to be debate about that. Mm-hmm. Would even that sort of absolute case, if we were to even grant it that far, do you think the argument still runs that it shouldn't be giving anything special over and above matters of conscience?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question about how the Rawlsian thought experiment would go. And And the later Rawls clearly would be very unhappy with that, because that is a essentially controversial, right, big claim about what there is. I'm not sure that introducing into the pieces of information available in the original position how exactly sort of a bare metaphysical thesis about the existence of a certain kind of thing, in this case a supernatural entity, God, right, would necessarily affect the deliberations. Because, of course, remember, the crucial bit of information Rawls in the 1971 book gives people in the original position is that they will have a sense of conscience, and that violating your sense of conscience is a very costly thing for an individual, very, very problematic. So I think you'd need more than just, as it were, a bare thesis about the existence of God. You would need some further thesis about the connection between the existence of a deity and the operations of conscience, right? But then, of course, right, if you build enough in, then you would get a different conclusion.
Sure. So, as a Nietzschean scholar, and one of the top Nietzschean scholars, do you think he offers a cogent criticism of Christianity, either as a belief system or as practice?
Well, so here's the thing about Nietzsche. He's not primarily concerned with criticizing Christianity as a general belief system, right? I mean, Nietzsche's an atheist. I think there's no question about that. But, Nietzsche also thinks the falsity of a belief is no objection to holding it. His primary criticism of Christian or other religious belief is not epistemic. His primary criticism, right, concerns a particular sort of morality that he associates with Christianity, but also with Judaism, and arguably can be associated with Islam and all the world's major religions in different ways. And his objections to that kind of morality and what he thinks of as the damaging and deleterious effects they have on human flourishing. So that's the real target. And I think, when you realize that's his real target, then it also becomes very clear that it's not religious people that are his particular target at all, because it includes all the secular liberals, it includes all the atheistic socialists and communists. Nietzsche's works were banned in the Soviet Union. There was a reason. The Soviet Union and Opus Dei, the very conservative Catholic organization, they agreed about this on Nietzsche, which is his views were wicked, and they didn't want any part of it. So, when you understand that, his interest in Christianity is largely a function of it's what he knew best, right? He came from a family of Lutheran pastors. In fact, he went to university planning to train to be a pastor, one of the great ironies for a guy who ends up writing a book called The Antichrist. But in the end, it's not so much the belief system as the value system that is his target. And here his challenge is, very, very radical, and I think when you appreciate it, pretty shocking. I will say that I'm sympathetic to some points he makes, not to all of them. Yeah. So by his lights, I'm a little bit of an adherent to slave morality. Or as Nietzsche puts it, right, he could have been talking about, Richard Dawkins. In the genealogy, he says, they hate the church but love the poison. Where the poison, the values, right, the values that he associates with Judeo-Christian morality, they maintain allegiance to the same set of values. And I'm not unsympathetic to those values. So, but I'm glad I feel I finally came to an understanding of what Nietzsche was up to, and it's a pretty radical challenge.